Well, that slideshow brought back some great memories. My first job out of college was as a youth minister. And unfortunately, our summer camp was not in Idlewild, California. It was in Tonganoxie, Kansas. But we all have some great memories. I'm still in touch with a couple of kids from that era. And camp is just a great experience. I also remember, I was thinking this week, my favorite Kansas preacher growing up had some clever quotations and sayings, some of which I still remember 50 years later. For example, it doesn't take much size to criticize and minimize the other guys. Isn't that a good one? Or when it looked like we were about to switch to the metric system in America, he said, it's gonna change our whole vocabulary. Instead of saying, give them an inch and they'll take a mile, we'll have to say, give them 2.54 centimeters and they'll take 1.6 kilometers. Except he had a whole bunch of others that I don't remember. But there was one I really wanted to use as the title of today's sermon, and I decided eventually not to, but I'm gonna mention it anyway. He used to say, life is hard by the yard, it's no cinch by the inch. That's pretty much true, I think, from the book of Job. Life is hard by the yard, it's no cinch by the inch. One of my favorite verses, it's not quite as catchy as my former preacher, but one of my favorite verses, Job chapter 7, verse 1, Job says, does not man have hard service on the earth? Don't you just feel that sometimes? Doesn't man have hard surface on the earth? So we begin our sermon on how to handle suffering, and we just have to admit this is very tough stuff from a man who suffered more than we can possibly imagine. And not only is the suffering hard, but I think getting our minds around the teachings of Job about suffering, I think that's also difficult. When Rabbi Harold Kushner was in graduate school and he had to propose a topic for his dissertation, he told his old professor, he said he'd like to write about, quote, the role of God in human tragedy. The old professor smiled and he said, you're not ready to write that yet. So we have to live some life, I think, maybe before we can fully appreciate some of the lessons of Job. And even then, they're hard to understand. In the case of Rabbi Kushner, years later, his young son died of a tragic disease. And that's when he thought it was time for him to write his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So the question, why suffering, that we asked last week, is something that I concluded, at least, we can't even get our minds around it. We're just left to acknowledge, as God said in Isaiah chapter 55, my ways are higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. There are things we're just not going to be able to understand in this life. And I'm not saying the question how we handle suffering, which is the question for this week, will be easy either, but here we go. So, whoops, I went too fast, too far. Psychologist Dr. Robert Puff underscores the theme of this next slide, that there are a lot of dead ends about how we handle suffering. There are a lot of paths we can take dealing with suffering that in the end really are not helpful or useful. The psychologist I mentioned, Robert Puff, says people often deal with suffering by suppressing it, just not dealing with it at all, numbing it, trying to ignore it, escape it, work around it. None of those really works, Dr. Puff points out, and he said if we don't deal with our suffering, it can lead to ongoing depression and more serious problems. Another dead end might be friends. Sometimes our friends, even well-meaning friends, can be a dead end, bringing their own frustration and despair, saying mistaken things like, well, God must have wanted your son or daughter with him up in heaven. I mean, I don't think that's a terribly useful expression, though perhaps well-meaning from a friend. And certainly we understand that Job's friends turned out to be the same kind of frustrating dead end. Job's 4 friends go on for 30 chapters in the book of Job, probing to try to figure out what Job must have done wrong in order to end up with this kind of calamitous suffering that he was experiencing. And Job does not find his friends to be helpful. They are another dead end in his dealing with suffering. And then we have our own doubts and questions. And we can get all wrapped up and lost in our own questions and our own frustrations and our own denials and our own problems. And that can be a dead end for suffering. But where do we go? As Job reminds us in chapter 20, verses 20 to 23, where does wisdom come from? Where are we going to find wisdom about our suffering? It's hidden from the eyes of every living thing, Job writes. God understands, and he alone knows where it dwells. So there are plenty of dead ends, and we've all probably taken some dead ends as we have dealt with the difficulty of suffering. But let's ask ourselves now, how did Job deal with his own suffering? And are there any useful lessons that we can draw from the way Job dealt with his suffering? And the first thing I think we notice about what Job did in his own suffering is he took his suffering right to God. He expressed his suffering directly to the Lord. Job was honest with God about how he felt and about how he was suffering. And I think the record shows that God appreciated Job's honesty. We need to understand that it's one thing to complain about God, and it's another thing to complain to God. And so Job showed us, I think it's entirely appropriate to take our complaints to God and let him help us with those. And so, as he says here in Job chapter 7 and verse 11, therefore I will not refrain my mouth, Job said. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. This is like our son Charlie when he was young, and he just kept going on and on. And I said something to him, and Charlie said, God made me to talk. So God made Job to talk, and Job talked. He expressed his complaints to the Lord. As I quoted earlier, and as I said, I think we can all relate to this. Job says in Job chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, that's a great chapter, by the way, Job 7, about how God took his complaints to God. Does not man have hard service on the earth? I have been allotted months of futility and nights of misery. And so Job, again, just took his complaints directly to the Lord. Job actually went searching for God in his suffering. He said, when I looked for good, evil came to me, and when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil, and it cannot rest. These are all appropriate things to take right to God and to say to him in our suffering. I like this next little verse. Job must have wondered, God, how much more does God think I can take? He says in chapter 6 and verse 12, do I have the strength of stone? Is my flesh bronze? Don't you get it, God? I have some limits here. I can't just keep taking things over and over again. And of course, God knows and understands suffering. He sent his own son, who was abused and forsaken, to die on a cross. And as the writer of Hebrews said in chapters 4 and chapter 5, we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who suffered and was tempted as we are. So taking our sufferings to God, a God who understands suffering, Job found to be a useful and important thing to do. The next thing Job did may sound kind of basic, but I think it might be hard to do, and that is Job maintained his faith in the face of suffering. Job maintained his faith. And sometimes, the big lessons in life really do go back to the basics like that. I don't know if any of you even remember Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show, but I remember one night he had Conrad Hilton, the famous hotel magnate, on his show, and after as he'd interviewed him for a while, Carson turned to Mr. Hilton and he said, why don't you turn to the camera, Mr. Hilton, and give the American people some message that you would like them to hear? And Hilton turned for the camera and he said, yes, the shower curtain goes inside the tub. So sometimes it's very basic things like that are the important messages. And I just think we have to say, in the face of suffering, Job, basic as it sounds, managed to maintain his faith in God. That's easy to say. I don't think it's easy to do. Job nevertheless learned to, as we just sang, trust and obey, for there's no other way. I really love that phrase. If there was a theme to the sermon today, that would be it. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. So there are a couple of passages that I think speak very powerfully to this, and these are two of my favorite passages in Job. The first is in Job chapter 13 and verse 15. He said, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him." Can you imagine that? Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. My faith in God is going to go forward no matter what happens. And then later in the book, in Job chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, he says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. After my skin has been destroyed, I will see God with my own eyes. How my heart yearns within me." And so these are very powerful, very strong, very resolute statements of faith. And I think we need to really just be prepared for that we continue in our faith kind of no matter, as Job learned, what happens. Sometimes in suffering, maybe all we can do is just hang on. We feel like our lives are dragged down by a powerful anchor. But as one of my teachers in college said to me, if we feel weighed down like our life is pulled down by an anchor, maybe we can just cast that anchor in the direction of God. Maybe that's all the strength we can muster, is just to say, God, I don't know what else to do here. My life is completely dragged down, but I'm going to take this anchor and throw it in your direction in the hope and in the trust that you can do something with me and for me. So there is Job trusting God when he did not understand what was happening, but nevertheless trusting God just the same. One of the things that I think we have to appreciate as Christians, and this is very strongly laid out in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25, is the way it works is that until the day of the Lord, until the Lord returns and takes us back into his own, until the day of the Lord, we were planned to live in a difficult world of suffering. I think sometimes we fail to appreciate that's the nature of the world we are living in until the day of the Lord. And so in Romans chapter 8, I just put up here a few excerpts. You might want to read the whole passage later. I consider, Paul writes, that our present suffering, it's not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. So we suffer now, but we know we have hope in the future. For he writes, "The creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation," Paul writes, "has been groaning, as in the pains for childbirth, right up to the present time. But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently." And that's exactly where Job is. Job is in a world of groaning and of suffering. And we live in a world where the whole creation is groaning and suffering. It seems like, if anything, it's groaning and suffering even more. But we wait with patience because we know that the day of the Lord will bring a new hope. So that's Job. That's the patience of Job, we sometimes say. But more than that, I would say it's the faith of Job, not just his patience. Because, as he says, trust and obey, for there's no other way. And then finally, I really like this point, and I'm finding this useful to work on in my own life. Finally, Job grew deeper roots in his suffering. Yes, he took his suffering to God. Yes, he held on to his faith in the face of suffering, but he was also able to grow deeper roots in God through his suffering. Scientists tell us that when plants are under stress, they grow deeper roots. Did you know that? When plants are in stress, when they're in heat, when they're in difficulty, when plants are in stress, they grow deeper roots. Why? Because they're searching deeper for water and for the nutrients that they need. And I think that's a wonderful picture of what we should do when we are under the stress of suffering. We should grow deeper roots, looking for the living water and the kind of nutrients that God can provide. And I didn't realize it until I was studying this week, but this is actually a recurring theme in the Bible. The prophet Jeremiah says in chapter 17, verses 7 and 8, that those who trust in the Lord will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. It has no worries in a year of drought. Why? Because it's growing wider and deeper roots. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we have the classic story of the parable of the sowers. And one of the places where the sower would throw his seed was in rocky soil. And in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 6, we're told that the seed didn't grow, but instead withered because they had no roots. And so the roots are crucial to our being able to survive and to flourish. Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 tells us to continue to live our lives in Jesus Christ, quote, rooted and builded up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. And so Job will say much later in the book, and we'll come to this at the end, that in his suffering, he came to see God more clearly. His roots grew deeper. They went deeper into the water and into the nutrients that God provided in his suffering. And so what a blessing that might be in our suffering is if we can grow deeper roots in the Lord. Well, in conclusion, once again, we turn to the greatest music of all time, classic rock of the 1960s and 70s. I'm so sorry some of you missed it, but it's still out there. You can still listen to it. To wrap this up, and some of you may remember this one. It goes, sometimes in our lives, we all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. So that's where we can end up in our suffering, is to understand that yes, we have pain, and yes, we have sorrow, but there is going to be a better day. And one of the verses that teaches this, that I find to be really one of the puzzling verses of the New Testament, is in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, where James writes, "Count it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete." So the ultimate fruit of suffering, according to Bill Withers in 1970, or according to James in the New Testament, it's that we develop perseverance for tomorrow, and we are stronger in our lives tomorrow because we have developed that perseverance. So the ultimate fruit of suffering could be something we didn't even expect, that we have learned to persevere through the trials. It's very much like probably my favorite verse in the New Testament. Hard to pick one, but if I had to pick one, it probably would be this one. Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. We can't always see how individual problems and suffering and pain can ultimately produce good. But I think that's the promise of Romans 8:28. Let me underscore this, not that everything that happens in our lives will be good, but that God will be able to work together all of the things that happen in our lives. And we can't always see how that's going to work, especially when we see the challenges and the problems, but that, I think, is the promise that God provides. It's a little bit like my dad. Uh-oh, did we miss my dad? There we go. It's a little bit like my dad, the baker. My dad was a baker, and I spent hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours in the back of a bakery And I told Sally when we got married, I said, don't worry about me having a job. I can fry donuts. Everybody always likes donuts. So I've made thousands of donuts in my day. But I would, as a little kid, I would watch my dad, and he'd be in the back of the bakery with this huge mixing bowl, and he'd be taking scoop after scoop after scoop of dry, unappetizing flour. And then he'd crumble up this thing called yeast that just smelled horrible and was cakey. And I thought, oh, I'd never want that to touch my lips. So he'd be crumbling up cakes of that and dropping it in the bowl. And if he was making banana bread, he would go out to the freezer and bring in his specially prepared rotten bananas that were just black and gooey. And those would go in the bowl. And I think, oh man, I will never want to eat that. But of course, once the master baker had them in the bowl and worked them all together, well, I was pretty interested in eating that because it tasted really good. So not to reduce it to simplicity, but as a kid, that helped me see how you could make good things out of bad things. And I think that's what Romans 8:28 is telling us, that even our suffering, God is able to work with that in our lives. He's able to help us with our suffering, as Job learned when he took his suffering directly to the Lord. We need to maintain our faith in him, even in the face of suffering. And we have an opportunity to grow deeper roots. Just like plants under stress grow deeper roots, we under stress should grow deeper roots to find the living water and the nutrients from the Lord. So in the end, we trust and obey, for there's no other way. I love that expression. We trust and obey, for there's no other way.